Now, that is a very tricky stage, because in the stage of anger, the key question, the overriding question is why? And underneath the question why, we are angry with God. God, where were you when my mother was dying? God, I have been faithful in tithing and doing everything required of me in the realm of the Christian disciplines. How can you let me down? Anger.
Well, welcome to Coffee with BDM. What a joy it has been just to be with Reverend Pastor, lecturer, teacher, a father and a good friend to me. Gregory Kivanguli has been a very, very good friend of mine and co-minister in the gospel for many years. And he is really, really blessed and loaded. I first knew him as a lecturer at the Daystar University, but at the moment, he is teaching and lecturing at the Kenya Methodist University. He is a lecturer there and the counselor of the university. Kenya Methodist University is going places, having great people like this. And it's such a joy to have him join us at the Coffee with BDM, coming to share with us about grief. Welcome. I don't know even what to call you. I would call you a bishop or reverend because you qualify for all titles, basically, because of the number of years you have been serving in the ministry. How many years have you served in the ministry?
Many years.
Many years.
I stopped counting.
Let me welcome you to Coffee with BDM today. Today we have a subject that has been disturbing many people in our country. It's about grief. What is grief?
Grief.
From a counseling perspective.
That's a very, very important question. Grief, basically, layman's language, is that experience of pain and distress following loss. Now, when we talk about loss, that brings about pain and distress. We're talking about loss of virtually anything. It can be loss of a human being through death. Mm-hmm. It can be loss of a pet, your favorite cat. It can be loss of a job. It can be loss of a marriage. So grief basically results from any kind of loss. And the loss must be of an object that is very highly valued by the person who experiences that loss. For them to suffer what we call typically, clinically, for them to experience what we call grief from a clinical point of view. So the object that is lost must be very, very highly treasured and valued. If, for example, I lose my ring, depending on how much significance I attach to my ring, it will dictate what kind of grief or the level of grief that I will experience. So that is basically what grief is all about. The experience of distress, the experience of pain, the experience of discomfort, which is brought about by loss of something valued by the individual.
Thank you so much for that answer. I want to ask, do people have to learn how to handle or go through grief?
Very important. It is assumed by many people that when you experience loss, you just get accustomed to it and get over it. As a counselor of many years, I have come across situations where somebody, for example, was bereaved of their spouse. And 1 year later, they were still experiencing that loss like it happened yesterday. And that's why it is important for people to seek help when they go through loss. I have been to situations where organizations were planning to retrench their employees. And because they are aware of the effect of retrenchment on people's lives, so they organize some preparation sessions so that they can minimize the effect of that retrenchment, one of which might be grief. Okay? And so you prepare them. But even after you have given them a talk, you still find some of the people after they have been retrenched, they suffer spiritually, psychologically, and even physically. So yes, people need to be helped to work. We call it working through grief, because it is a process. It's a journey. The grieving experience is actually a journey. And how long one takes it depends on a number of factors. Personality differences. You know, there are some guys whose personalities are very strong and very solid. There are others whose personalities are very shaky. Like what we describe as a very highly emotional personality. The technical term is histrionic personality. People that tend to be very highly emotional, they will cry, for anything. Yeah? Even if they pour their cup of tea, it might make them cry. Now, those kind of people might take much longer to process grief. But bottom line, we need help.
Let me ask you, Reverend.
Yes.
Do we have then stages of grief?
Yes,
and
we do.
A follow-up question would be,
yes.
Are those stages written in stone? Or they can be in different various types in different people?
A very good question. A very well-known doctor who was also a pediatrician by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, an American doctor. In the course of her work with the patients, especially as she watched her patients face death, she discovered that many people tend to follow a particular pattern as they face their moment of, pain. And so came out with what has now been popularly referred to as the stages of grief. And according to Kubler-Ross, the first stage she identified as denial. Now, there are some people who may not experience denial at first. There are others who will experience shock. I have been in situations where somebody got news about the death of somebody they loved, and they collapsed. That's not denial, it's shock.
Yeah.
Some might even experience panic, okay? But according to Kubler-Ross, most of the people will experience something we call denial. Denial is that reaction of disbelief. I can't believe that Bishop David is dead. I can't believe that he has been fired from House of Grace Church. That's called denial. And the denial is not necessarily negative. In fact, psychologists will say denial can act as a buffer. It can save you from crashing. So it is actually healthy initially to experience some denial, some sense of denial. Because if you don't experience denial, you might experience shock and actually die. I remember when I was a pastor at NPC Valley Road, a family lost a member through death. And another family member, a young man, on hearing getting the news of the death of the other person, went into shock and actually died. It would have been better if they had that experience of denial or disbelief. And then as somebody works through that process of denial, and it depends on how much time, depending on the factors that I talked about, individual differences, then one is likely to move on to the second stage, according to Kubler-Ross, which is the stage of anger. Now, that is a very tricky stage, because in the stage of anger, the key question, the overriding question is why? And underneath the question why, we are angry with God. God, where were you when my mother was dying? God, I have been faithful in tithing and doing everything required of me in the realm of the Christian disciplines. How can you let me down? Anger. Again, we are not saying it is abnormal to express anger. It's just the way we human beings are created emotionally, okay? And Job was actually angry with God. In fact, what Job went through is very similar to what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross observed. Okay? So anger, the key question is why? And we are angry at God. We can even be angry with ourselves. I could have done this, or if I did X, Y, and Z, maybe this couldn't have happened. So we become angry with ourselves. We can become angry with our children. We can become angry even with our pet in the house. We can become angry with our employer and so forth and so on and so on. But then as we continue to get accustomed to our laws, then we move to another very interesting stage, which we refer to as bargaining. Now, at the stage of bargaining, the laws is beginning to become a reality. Now, bargaining happens especially when the loss is related with some terminal illness. You have somebody who is dying with the cancer. They are in their terminal stages. And, you are already grieving, even though the person is not dead. So you begin to bargain with God. God, if you heal my mother, I am going to serve you better. I am going to give more than I have ever given. That's what we call bargaining. And it's a psychological reaction. Okay? You have seen where some people not only experience denial but combine denial with bargaining, where some people have died, Christians, and believers have not believed that they have died, and then they began intercessory prayer for them to rise, and then they make promises that if you raise bishop, this church, we are going to do da-da-da-da-da. That is called bargaining. And it is a psychological reaction we are going through. But then we move on from bargaining and we move on to what for us is the most important stage. Importance in terms of if we don't deal with that stage carefully, the person can be adversely affected. And that is what we call depression. Now, if you ask me in my professional work as a counselor, it is that stage of depression where I say the loss becomes a reality. It becomes a reality, and then you are gripped with the feelings of sadness, helplessness, hopelessness, and your functionality is affected either psychologically or emotionally. You find, for example, your sleeping patterns have changed, your appetite has changed, your physiological functions are also, showing signals like abdominal upsets and so forth and so on. But basically the person is acknowledging the loss is a reality, and so I am helpless in the face of this loss. And that is where we say if help doesn't come sooner than later, you can actually lose the grieving person either to some disease or even to death. But the good news is that I have seen people work through depression and they pull through to the last stage, which is the resolution stage, which Kubler-Ross called acceptance. At the end of the day, we work towards helping the people accept, yes, this is reality, life must continue, okay? So there are those stages, but you asked a very important question. Are they cast in stone? The answer is no. In fact, there are people who don't experience denial, who accept right away, this is a reality, I must get on with life. There are some who don't go through those stages, who jump straight to the last stage. And again, that will depend on what resources you have at your disposal. We have, for example, this well-known British minister called David Watson. David Watson was an Anglican clergyman, and he came down with cancer. And David Watson was gifted in the ministry of healing. He laid hands on many people that were miraculously healed. But then he went down with cancer of the stomach. And he was dying in the fourth stage of that disease. And he was interviewed by a journalist. And he was asked to explain this mystery. You praying for others to be healed, but you are dying and you cannot pray for yourself. And I like the answer he gave. He said, God can heal you either physically directly and restore you to physical health. That's one. And that is his prerogative. But he can also heal you in your situation, right? He can let you continue with your suffering, but he gives you grace that helps you to overcome your suffering even though you still have the disease. And finally, he can heal you into his presence. So he answered and said, even if I die, death itself is a form of healing. Okay, now such a person will not go through grief in the same way a person who doesn't have the same faith will face grief. So depending on your orientation, and let me point out, Bishop, and I think it is good for our listeners to know this. Research, extensive research has shown that people who depend on spiritual resources like faith, prayer, the support of other fellow Christians have been known, and we have evidence to be more effective in managing grief than people who don't have faith at all. Okay, so you don't have to go through those stages. How you go through those stages, how you face your grief will depend on a number of factors, your orientation, your religious orientation, and so forth and so on.
Are the stages 4 or 5?
I talked about 5 of them, but I said, remember when I began? I said some people may experience panic or shock. So even though Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came out with 5 stages, experience has shown that there could be other things that people experience, okay, other than those 5, okay, like panic,
yes,
which is not part of those 5, shock. When we went to the service, the burial service at Kivanguli Secondary School, where over 60 students died through a school fire. You remember that story? I led a team of counselors into that place. And I saw this one mother who lost 2 children in that fire. She had 2 students in that school, and both of them died. You know, when the caskets were lined there in front of everybody, you know, that lady simply collapsed and became completely numb. You know, like dead. And I remember the paramedics, especially from Mamref and the Red Cross and St. John's, had to swing into action. So, they may not be exactly 5, but what I talked about is what is extensively documented, but it varies from one person to another, and it depends on the circumstances and the environment in which the person operates. Although I need a rejoinder here, Even though I said you may have resources that may help you cope with the stress, with grief, we have also found out that people that work in situations where they have to face a lot of pain and the suffering, I'm talking about doctors, I'm talking about medical workers and so forth and so on. Bishop, it is interesting to note, they get affected by loss as much as the ordinary person who doesn't work. I have seen doctors cry upon losing their patient. One time as I worked at Kiambu Hospital, I remember we were trying to resuscitate a patient who unfortunately passed on. And I saw the doctor break down.
Reverend, can somebody be stuck in a stage and not get out of it?
Yes.
And stay there, for the longest?
Yes.
And maybe never ever come out of it?
Well, I wouldn't say never come out of it, because if help comes along, pastoral counseling, psychological counseling, some kind of help, they may be helped to get out. For example, I have known of people who have lost spouses. And guess what? A year later, they are still lining up the pajamas of the deceased person alongside where they sleep.
Wow.
Typical example of somebody who has lived in denial, right? I have talked about the cases where people don't believe somebody has died and they continue praying, okay? So you can be stuck. The stage that I said is the most important in terms of counseling and pastoral care, I said is depression. And unfortunately, a lot of people tend to get stuck in that stage of depression, because you know what happens? It might begin as depression following grief, but it might translate into a more serious depression and border on the clinical depression. Now, when we talk about clinical depression, we are saying that the person is not just grieving. Something is happening in their physiology. Some chemical substances, like what we would refer to as the neurotransmitters and so forth and so on. Some chemical substances begin to get disrupted, okay? The way they function tends to, to swing towards the abnormal. Either those chemical substances are not being produced enough as required, or they are being produced excessively. For example, you have heard of terms like dopamine, adrenaline, very good example, adrenaline, serotonin, and so forth and so on. And so, if a person has not been helped to overcome depression, which could be the fourth stage in the process of grief, then it can translate into something more serious, and the person might actually be put under medical care for them to be able to pull through.
And when it gets to that, let me ask you, is that a question of counseling or is it a question of psychiatric?
It is both. It is both. You see, the counselor provides psychological support and also spiritual support. The doctor deals with the clinical issues, like where there are issues with the body chemicals and some of those things that become dysfunctional. Then you need the intervention of a doctor. This term that we call bipolar disorder, that's an example of what I mean when we are saying that the depression, graduates from a reactive form of depression. Reactive form of depression, I got my results and I found I got a D- meaning grade, and I get depressed. That's called reactive depression. I reacted to a situation. But if it is not dealt with, it can actually graduate. Yeah? Because when I react, if I don't get support, my body begins to react in certain ways and begins to get overwhelmed. by that experience that I have gone through. And if I am not supported, it might move on to that level where I might need medical intervention. For example, if I cannot get sleep, if I am completely unable to sleep, I may need medical intervention. That's where the intervention of the psychiatrist or the clinician is required. But generally, we are supposed to work as a team. The doctor has his role, the counselor has his or her role, the pastor has his role. We come together into what we call the healing team or the healing community in order to provide concerted effort to help this person work through grief. So when a person is going through grief, they will need a pastor.
Yeah.
They will need a counselor. And if the pastor has counseling training, the better. They will need a doctor if they are manifesting symptoms that indicate that their physiology is, experiencing challenges. Okay, they will need a doctor. And they will need other support, support from the family and from the community.
A lot of Christians don't believe in psychiatric care. They think it's demonic.
Unfortunate.
And they would be praying, and fasting instead of even taking the patient to hospital. What do you say about that?
I would say that is very, very unfortunate. And it has a history. It has a history because in Europe, in the 17th century and part of the 18th century, they used to have what they used to call asylums. They were not called mental hospitals.
Yeah.
They were called asylums. And asylums were places where people with mental disorder were locked up and chained and sometimes beaten.
Yeah.
And underneath the way they were treated were the beliefs and the myths that people held about mental illness. One of the myths was could be demon possession. It could be as a result of a curse and so forth, or it could be somebody has been bewitched. Hence, the way they treated them. Now, this is a very, very, very complex area. But I want to put the record straight. Demon possession can manifest in ways that looks similar to somebody who has mental illness. The man called Legion in the Bible. We see people with mental illness who behave exactly like that man. And for you to be able to make the distinction, it requires not only discernment, but it required that you have knowledge of both the scriptures and the general knowledge. And that's why, Bishop, people like me count it a favor and a blessing from God that I'm able to delve into the two. On many occasions, I have been able to tell that this could be a case of demon possession rather than a case of mental illness. But to erase any doubt, I recommend that the person goes through an assessment by a clinician. All right? Now, if a person has demon possession, the way you can tell with certainty is that this person has demon possession is that when you cast them, they cast them out, they come out and go. Okay? And so, before you conclude that, you don't believe in mental illness and so forth and so on, you need to acknowledge that even in the Bible, we had mad people, all right? And but you need to be able to tell, and if you cannot tell, you need expertise. You need people that are knowledgeable and that, are more competent in being able to describe those kind of situations.
So somebody should actually just run to the counselor when they feel like it's out of control and they're not able to handle it? Or so many people, have got cases where they've experienced loss, but they don't go to any pastor or look for any help. The bulk majority.
They might be ignorant that help is available. That could be part of the reason why they don't seek for help. And again, even the counseling profession itself, just like mental health practice, we have our own challenge. And the challenge is, a lot of people out there think that a bishop is going to see a counselor, then there must be something wrong with his head, which is a wrong notion. Every human being has challenges. In fact, somebody called Peck Scott, who wrote the famous book, The Road Less Traveled. In the very first chapter of that book, he begins by saying, life is difficult. And he goes ahead to say, everybody has struggles. Unfortunately, counseling and mental health work has been associated with people that are breaking down, whose nuts have been loosened, okay, which is a misconception. All of us need counseling. There isn't anybody in the world who can say that they don't need counseling. As a practicing counselor myself, I get counseling. In fact, in counseling practice, we call it counseling supervision. So if I have been counseling and I've been listening to painful stories, overwhelming stories, I also get overwhelmed. So what do? I go and look for a fellow counselor. And we sit down and I pour out. We call that debriefing. I ventilate what I'm going through. The same thing should happen in ministry. If I am ministering and I'm not getting as much outcome as I expect, I can get depressed. So I need to go and talk to a fellow minister or even a counselor and share, because a problem shared is a problem solved.
Well, it is supposed that every pastor should be a counselor. Is every pastor a counselor?
Not quite. Because if you look at the curriculum in the various theological schools, it is only recently they started teaching pastoral counseling. But we have had the curricula where you study a lot of biblical studies, you study a lot of theology, you study a lot of pastoral ministry stuff, and not counseling, per se. So every pastor may be performing, skills and tasks that may look like counseling, but not every pastor is a counselor. And I dare say, for you to be a counselor, you need to be properly trained and grounded in the skills, because there are certain skills and techniques, not just theories. There are certain skills and techniques that are critical for anybody to be called a counselor. For example, a very simple one. Do you know not every pastor is empathetic? What is empathy? Empathy is that situation where I try as much as possible to put myself in the shoes of the other person, where I try as much as possible to see the world from the perspective of the other person. Can I tell you, not everybody can do that. You need training, because the way you express empathy has to do with the way you communicate your understanding of the other person's problem. So the kind of questions you ask will determine whether you are empathetic or not. For example, if you told me, I've just lost my mother, I might ask you, when did you lose your mother? That might look like a relevant question, but it does not demonstrate empathy. When you tell me, I've just lost my mother, for me to show empathy, which requires training, I need to say something like, oh, I can imagine what you must be feeling. You know what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to enter into your realm of experience by making a statement to see whether I am communicating to your inner feelings. It must be feeling overwhelming for you to have lost your mother. Now, it is you that will confirm that you are overwhelmed or not. So that is a skill that requires training and practice.
Can you be grieving and not be aware that you're grieving? Or could you be depressed and you're not aware?
That's a very interesting question.
That you're depressed?
That is a very interesting question. And a favorite one of mine. Because now that touches on what I called the clinical dimension of depression. If you can be depressed and not accept that you are depressed. Now, clinically, we call that lack of insight, lack of awareness that you have a problem. And that happens mostly with the people who have what we call psychotic behavior or psychotic conditions. A very major one is what we call schizophrenia. A lot of people who have chronic schizophrenia may not be aware that they are sick. For example, I might sit here if I have schizophrenia, and I might tell you that my name is not Kivanguli, but my name is Budapest. Okay? And I am not Kenyan. I will tell you a land which does not exist. That means no matter how much you convince me, you cannot get me out of my frame of thinking because I am not aware that I am sick. And that is where medication, that's where you need the intervention of the psychiatrist. That's where you need the intervention of the doctor to be able to bring control into the physiological functions that might be responsible for what is happening to this person. So you can be sick and not be aware you're sick. You can be depressed and not acknowledge that you are depressed.
What are some of the signs of depression? Common signs.
Feeling of sadness, helplessness, hopelessness, diminishing deterioration of functions like sleep, poor sleep, and the sleep can be on either extreme, okay? Either you are sleeping too much or you are not sleeping at all. Both of them are bad, okay? If you sleep the whole day, that is equally bad as if you don't sleep at all. Problems with appetite, all right? Either you are not eating at all or you are eating too much, okay? That is problematic. Problems with the interactions, relationships with other people. You cannot relate because you are depressed. And so you find you want to be alone, withdrawal, you want to be alone. And then, of course, feelings of, like you ought not to be there. And that's why a lot of the suicides that take place in the world today, the majority of them are people who have some form of depression, okay? And it is that feeling of hopelessness, feeling there is no reason to live, that they take their lives. And depression has been referred to as the common cold of mental health because virtually everybody catches it. Virtually everybody, including babies. Even babies get depressed, right? So it's very common.
So you're basically saying that it can be physical, and then if it's not attended to, it can be spiritual.
Yes, I was saying, yes, it can be spiritual. And I said for you to be able to discern, to distinguish whether it is spiritual or clinical, you need training and expertise. I think I did say that, okay? But it is not right to jump up and say, if somebody has depression, they have demons. No, you need to do an assessment. You need to do an evaluation. You need to evaluate this person for you to determine whether it could be, okay? Depression is one of the results of loss, like we have already seen, grief, okay? And I said that loss can be anything, okay? It can be loss of success in an exam and so forth and so on, okay? But if it continues where the person now operates outside the normal, the expected normal, because what is normal is what society and that person's culture defines as normal. If the person is operating out of the normal, then you need to find out. Is it because the pain of failing the exam was so much that they cannot bear it and that they end up sick? Again, you need to find out what expectations did this person have in their system? What kind of worldview do they subscribe to? Now, can I elaborate on that? In Japan, for example, the Japanese society, so success in the Japanese society is pegged on how you do well, either in school, and that's why Japan at one time was the leading country in suicides, especially among young people, because in that country, success is in their worldview. If you don't succeed, you're useless. And so a lot of people give up and get depressed and in the process take their lives. One time in the middle of the night, I got a telephone call from Japan of a Kenyan who was studying there and was telling me he has given up on life and he wants to take his life. And up to today, I've never known who that person was, but I think it must have been a person from our church at NPC, okay? Because he found himself in a culture where success is everything. But as we know from the Bible, success is not everything. Everything is knowing Jesus, yeah? As the truth, the way, and the life. That is what we call everything. I can have a lot of money and not have peace. So money is not everything. Although money is good, money will help me to live well and to live where I want, but it's not everything. Because I can live in Mudaiga, but still not have peace. Okay? There are many parameters that make what we call success. Okay? So, depression is very common, and it can either be reactive, it can be environmentally instigated because of where the person is, or it can be clinical. People who come from families where there has been a person with depression, especially bipolar disorder, are more likely to suffer from depression than people who come from homes where there is no history of depression. Twin studies, research, especially focusing on twins, has established these facts to be true. That if you come from a family where there is a history, even schizophrenia is the same. Okay? And those are the cases that I'm calling clinical. Okay? But where somebody went and indulged in some witchcraft practices and started picking peppers on the road, you know, the likelihood is that that person might be under some spiritual spell. And so they need to be dealt with spiritually.
I agree. So what would you say, if I was to give you just a minute, to somebody who's grieving at the moment, what would be your word to them?
Very good question. If you are grieving, you need resources to help you cope with your grief. Number one, you need spiritual resources. And what are they? Even this word we call the Bible, because it has numerous case studies of people that went through loss, like Job, people like Jacob, people like David. You remember when David, he lost that baby who was born out of adultery with Bathsheba, and he made that famous statement that since the baby is dead, then I need to get on with the life because he cannot come back to me. It is me who will go back to him. You know, that's a statement of hope and the future. And that is healing in itself. So if somebody is going through grief, they need One, spiritual resources. They need to know that there is a God who stands with us in times of grief, who says that is our present help in times of need. In the book of Psalms, why are you downcast, O my soul? Put your trust in God. That's one resource. Number two, you also need human resources. You also need the human element to support you in your grief. You need your family, you need your community, and you need the church. So when somebody is going through grief, then they need the support of others around them. And thirdly, you need professional help. If you have reached that stage where you are beginning to experience what we would call clinical symptoms or clinical signs of, your grief, then you need professional help like counseling and so forth and so on. And then, grief is not necessarily bad at the end of the day. Grief can be positive. It was Paul who said, and we know that all things work together for good. To those who love God, those who are called according to his purpose. So my grief can be a learning experience for myself and for others who depend on me. So if I go through it successfully, then I can be an encourager to somebody else who might be going through grief. The experience of pain can teach us a number of lessons, like, for example, never to take life for granted. So even when we lose, that loss can be a stepping stone into something that we have never thought about, okay? Like, for example, those who are parents, they might take it for granted that it's just kawaida to our parents. Wait until they lose. It's when they know what it means to lose a parent. So, someone, and it doesn't matter what level of a person one is, every one of us has emotions, and those emotions are diversely affected when we experience pain. We all need to seek help. One time a professor friend of mine lost his wife, and we went to his home. And to date, the memory of the experience of that day is still in my mind. And I found this professor screaming like a little baby, which is normal, okay? There are some people who think that it is wrong to cry when you are bereaved. And we blame people from Western Kenya and, from Nyanza and so forth. From where I come from in the Eastern, they say crying is a sign of weakness. And for me, that is high-class nonsense. Crying is a way of expressing, ventilating what is happening inside. So you need to be helped to express your grief in the best way possible. There's a funny example in the University of Nairobi Medical School. When they get their results, doctors, they start screaming. And they lie on the road like they are screaming because of loss of somebody, but they're actually screaming because of their success, and secondly, because they have lost their status as students. So they scream and they lie on the road, and it would be foolish for somebody to condemn those young people, because that's the best way they know how to celebrate success. So grief is something that can be overwhelming if we don't get support.
Wow, thank you so much, Reverend Kivanguli, for being with us.
Welcome.
And thank you so much for helping the many, many people who are going through these difficult moments of grief, who may not even have an idea how to handle it. But I know that even as they watch this program, that they are now equipped, and by the grace of God will go through that very, very turbulent moment of going through tough times of losing and loss and grief and depression, and coming to the reality and accepting that, not everything lives forever, but by the grace of God, God helps us, and He is the God of all comfort, as the scripture tells us.
Amen.
So thank you so much for making time, and I pray that
Welcome.
God will continue blessing you and using you
Thank you.
to be a blessing to the many, many people that you have blessed in this country and beyond.
Thank you.
Well, this Sunday we are going to be having our services as usual, our House of Grace, 9 o'clock to 10:30. I'm going to be speaking right here, and then of course our second service is from 11 o'clock to 12:30. Thank you for being with us, and I trust that you are now well aided and well equipped, and I pray that God gives you the grace. And just in case you know somebody who's going through grief, please share this video with them and let them know that there's help and they're not left alone. God bless you, and see you next time right here on Coffee with BDM.